Let's take our reading from the first story of the nativity scene recorded in the New Testament, one of two stories, and this one is found in Matthew, the 2nd chapter. And I'm reading from the New International Version. And it reads, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, 'Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.' When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all of the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. 'In Bethlehem in Judea,' they replied, 'for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared, sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him.' After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen went and rose ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route." This is a familiar story, and I want to talk a little bit about the wise men from the east. Who were these guys? Why are they here? What are they about? Most of what we know about the wise men from the east, or what we think we know about the wise men from the east, we get from Christmas cards and from Christmas songs. Much of our understanding, our theology, our history of these mysterious persons comes from traditions. For instance, we speak of them as being three. There were three men, even though the scriptures do not give a specific number. It simply says that Magi came from the east to Jerusalem. So there were at least more than one, but it doesn't say that there are three. There could have been more. There could have been 50, 20. We don't have that information. We come up with three, no doubt, because there are three gifts brought: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so the tradition stuck, and we put a limit that there were three wise men. Tradition actually gives these three characters names: Caspar, Belshazzar, and Melchior. Again, there's no scriptural basis for this, but this is what tradition has passed down, that there were three wise men, and these were their names. There's even a tradition that archaeologists recovered the three skulls of the three wise men. And how they know these skulls belong to them, we don't know, but that is another tradition about the wise men, that their skulls were recovered. Another tradition is they are at the manger. They are at the manger looking over baby Jesus, and we see much of this in the Christmas cards. That also may or may not be the case. When we read in the scripture It says, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed on coming to the house. So Mary and Joseph are no longer in a manger, they are in a house. So the scriptures would seem to indicate that there's a difference in time frame from when he was born in a manger to when these three wise men come. Another indication is they saw the child. Not a baby, not an infant, but they saw a child. Now, a baby certainly could be referred to as a child, but it also goes on, it says that Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi. He was furious and gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem in the vicinity who were 2 years old and under. So again, he doesn't send out to kill babies, newborn babies, but a time frame of 2 years and under. So this seems to suggest that the Magi were not at the nativity scene in the manger, but sometime that could have been a year or so afterward when they are in the house. Another tradition is that they are regarded as kings. And we get this from the song, of course, "We three kings of Orient are, bearing gifts, we traverse afar." And it's very unlikely that they are kings. It is very unlikely that any king from a nation would leave his throne, travel to Bethlehem to see a baby in a manger. But tradition, again, has made them kings, where the Bible, again, simply calls them wise men from the east. Other translations call them Magi from the east. So who are these guys? What are they? And why are they here? It should raise questions because whoever they are, they travel to see a newborn king. Well, we don't see them doing that for anybody else. Any other nation, the king of Syria, they didn't have Magi showing up when a new king was born in another nation. They didn't show up for Herod. But here they're in Bethlehem to acknowledge a baby who they believe is the king. Magi is a word that we get our word magic or magicians. Okay, so the modern word of magicians has come from this word magi. But when we think about magicians, we shouldn't think of the magicians in our frame of reference. Wasn't so much of David Copperfield, but was more like a sorcerer or wizards or a diviner, people that would speak to the spirit worlds. This was not uncommon in the ancient world. There was always a relationship between magi, or these spiritualist people, and the kings. Israel would often refer to their priests and their prophets for their guidance. So when a king of Israel was looking to do something, he didn't call the sorcerers, the witches, the diviners, he called the prophets. But other nations, other kings, this was a very common practice. So the Magi were not confined to any particular nation. They were all over the world. And they were in every kingdom. Kings often worked with them. We see this in the time of Moses. When Moses is there before Pharaoh and he throws down the staff that becomes a serpent, we see magicians that come and imitate the acts of Moses. We also see this with King Saul. If you recall, King Saul is a rejected king. He was a disobedient king, and God no longer was speaking to him. And so he, King Saul, inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go and inquire of her." "There is one in Endor," they said. So he finds a witch. Then the woman asks, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" "Bring up Samuel," he said. So understand what's happening here. We have a king who doesn't have any prophets. So he actually goes and gets a witch to give him guidance. The witch summons up in a seance a dead prophet, Samuel. Then we read, Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" "I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me either by prophets or by dreams, so I called you to tell me what to do." So here we see even an Israeli king felt that it was not fitting to go into war without getting some kind of spiritual advice, even if it was coming from a medium in this case. So throughout history, we see kings would often consult the Magi, the magicians, the sorcerers, the mediums, to get guidance from the gods. We need to know what we're going to do about this crisis. How are we going to handle this war? And what they would do is they would call Magi and magicians and sorcerers. Well, what does that have to do with the wise men in Bethlehem? Let's go way back in time, and we read of a mysterious prophet who actually is a false prophet by the name of Balaam. Balaam is one of these sorcerers. He's one of these guys that speaks to the spirits. And for those who are unfamiliar, he's the one with the talking mule, okay, the talking donkey story. And what happens here is at the time, Israel is wandering in the wilderness, and there is, lo, a king who doesn't like what he sees. He sees all these people gathering around his nation, and he's unnerved. So he's looking for some kind of spiritualist who will speak with him about this. So we read, now Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. The Moabites said to the elders of Midian, "This horde is going to lick up everything around us as an ox licks up the grass in the field." So Balak, the son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at the time, sent messengers to summons Balaam, son of Beor, who was at Bethor near the Euphrates River in his native land. Now understand what happens here. This king needs a spiritualist to advise him on this crisis that's happening. So he calls Balaam. Now, Balaam doesn't live down the block from him. Balaam is actually quite a ways from him. When we look at a map, here is Israel, and there is Moab. So this is where they are at. And Pethor is to the east by the Euphrates River. Now, why that is significant, this is where Balaam lives. That land would later become known as Babylon, part of the Babylonian Empire. So Balaam is from the Babylonian region, or what will become the Babylonian region. Let's get back to the story. It says in Numbers 22, Balak said, "A people has come out of Egypt and have covered the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come, put a curse on these people, because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps I will be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land, for I know that whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed." So he calls Balaam to this task. And Balaam now, after you read the story and the talking donkey, and God has to deal with this man, he comes and he gives a prophecy. This is what he says. Then he spoke his message, the prophecy of Balaam, son of Beor, the prophecy of one whose eye sees clearly, the prophecy of one who hears the words of God, who has knowledge from the Most High, who sees a vision from the Almighty and falls prostrate, whose eyes are open. And this is what he says in this prophecy. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the people of Sheth. So Balaam gives a prophecy. Now again, what does that have to do with what we're talking about tonight? Well, fast forward 900 years from this time of the prophecy of Balaam. And Israel is now in captivity in Babylon. Now, where do we say Balaam was from? Babylon. And when we think of Babylon, we're reminded of another prophet by the name of Daniel. The prophet Daniel, he's the one who was thrown into the lion's den and is spared. Well, the scriptures say some very interesting things about this particular prophet Daniel. And his story goes with a king, again, in trouble. Nebuchadnezzar's having a dream. It says, in the second year of the reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his mind was troubled and could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians. So again, you see the pattern here. The king gets into trouble. He's in a crisis. He calls for magicians and sorcerers, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he dreamed. When they came in, they stood before the king, and he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Now, Nebuchadnezzar would recap the story here and says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. I was lying on the bed, and an image and visions had passed through my mind, terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence. I told him the dream. He is called Belshazzar, after the name of my gods, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. I said, Belshazzar, chief of the magicians. Notice what Daniel is called here, chief of the magicians. I know the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream, and interpret it. So Daniel is actually made and given the position of chief magician. So he's the top Magi in Babylon. Years later, another king would get into trouble. And here's the story of the son who sees the handwriting on the wall. By the way, he doesn't see handwriting on the wall. He sees a hand writing on the wall. There's a difference. And so you can see why he is unnerved. And all the king's wise men came in, but could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voice of the king and the nobles, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever. And he said, don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. And again, we read, your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, and the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. So what does all this have to do with the nativity story? Well, if Daniel is made the chief Magi, the chief of the musicians, then he certainly would have known about the prophecy of Balaam. And he would have had the influence over the people that were under him. And he would have told them about this prophecy and what would happen. So hundreds of years later, what we see is wise men coming from the Babylon area. And these wise men, I believe, were students of the prophet Daniel, who had been told that the Messiah was to be born and he would be the king. And he taught his people to look for them. And so when we get to Bethlehem, we see these wise men coming from the school of Daniel. And that's why they're there. And that's what they're doing. And that's who they are. Now, when I think of the story of Bethlehem, and when I read this story, what comes to my mind, what strikes me, is understand Bethlehem is a very busy place at this time. It's crowded because there's a census. And you know the story, there was no room in the inn, and that's why Mary and Joseph had to find the manger to deliver the baby. But with all of the people that are in town this day, it's the people that traveled hundreds of miles that get to recognize the Messiah. It's people in the field, the shepherds who are out of the city and in the fields. They hear the angelic choir and come to worship Jesus. Mary and Joseph themselves aren't from Bethlehem. They traveled to Bethlehem. In other words, what about the people who were right next door? And they didn't realize that the Messiah had come into the world. I don't want to be somebody who's around a lot of people but don't know who Jesus is. I don't want to be someone who comes out to church but don't know who Jesus is. I don't want to be one of those people who hears about it all the time, who knows the story, but we miss the glory. We know that Jesus came into the world, but we don't recognize him. We hear other people talk about him. Other people worship him. Other people sing about him. There were people right next door. There were people right down the block that didn't realize that something had happened in the world. It took people from outside. I'm glad that one day God turned the light on in my eyes and he opened me up and he let me see the glory of God. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore. But the master of the sea, he heard my cry, and it was God that gave me light. And I'm glad I can say tonight that I know who Jesus is. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. I thank God I come to give God praise because he made himself known to me.